I'm sure you have people in your life, I kind of call them passers-by in your life, people that you see a lot, and they perform a function in your life, but you really don't know everything that goes on inside of them. I was just captivated by what happened yesterday at a funeral I did. I hadn't seen John in about a year. He would come every Sunday to the early service and sit in the back row, very humble. He'd come in early, he'd sit in the back row. After church, he would leave. And as he left, he would always say, "Good work, young man. I'll be back next Sunday." And I love those words, young man. That was kind of fun. John Brunel was a drywaller. He would drywall and tape. He had an old car. And when he came to do a job, he had all this stuff in the trunk. I mean, he did ladders and tarps and stuff. And when he got done working at your house doing the drywall, wherever he worked was cleaner than when he got there. He was just that kind of guy. If you remember a few years ago, we had all kinds of roofing problems, and we had to raise money, and you guys contributed for that. And by the time the roof and the gym was fixed, the ceiling was shot. I mean, there were all kinds of cracks in the drywall up there. And so one day I just said, "John, I know you're busy and you're good, but is there any way we can hire you to just fix the gym ceiling?" He said, "No problem, I'll take care of it." And I said, "Well, when will you start?" He said, "Whenever I want to." And a couple of days later, we have a lift, and so I just parked the lift in the gym and gave him a key to the church, and he would come, go in, he'd work, and he'd go home. He'd come, he'd go in, and he'd work, and he'd go home. And about a month later, the ceiling was perfect. And along the way, I would say, "John, how much do I owe you?" And he said, "Well, we'll worry about that later." And so finally, it was getting toward the end, and I said, "John, I got to give you some money." I said, "If you don't take some money for this job, I will take your key and lock the door, and you'll never get in here again." And he said, "Okay." But he only took a little bit. John died this week. He, a year ago, moved in with his mom. His mom is like 95 years old. And so he decided that that was his calling. He lived alone, and so he took care of his mom, and he had a daughter in Wisconsin. And he went up to see his daughter at Christmas, and they had a little dusting of snow, and he was out brushing it. He went in to use the washroom and never came out. He had a heart attack in their house. And so they brought him back here, and we had the funeral yesterday. And he just came here and left, didn't really know many people in the church. And the place yesterday was packed, absolutely packed. They had a visitation for 3 hours. People lined up through the narthex. And for the service, there was hardly an empty chair. And I'm thinking to myself, he was a drywaller, came here by himself. And all these stories about John coming to people's homes and fixing their ceiling and fixing their wall. And his daughter said, "This is why when I was little and I came here, we had no money. Because my dad would go to work every single day, and he'd come home and say, 'Well, the family's kind of struggling and they're going through a tough time, so I didn't really charge him that much.' And half the time he didn't charge anything. And people were talking about how he would do this for people in need, how he would coach their kids. He made sure everybody played. He became a father figure to kids on the block whose parents were kind of broken. And John, the only thing I knew about him was he liked to study different religions. He was like a Unitarian and a mystic and a Buddhist and a Lutheran wrapped up into one person. And his favorite saying was from the Dalai Lama. He would always say, "I don't need fancy temples. My own heart is my temple, and my religion is kindness." And John is one of those guys that actually walked and worked his religion. I tried to talk about it, and I didn't even do it as well as John did. But I've always said, you can teach catechism until you're blue in the face. You can go to CCD around the clock. You can listen to inspired preaching, which is never had to been your problem. You can take religion and talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, but the only way to really discover who God is by the people you hang out with. When you meet people that are gentle and kind, when you meet people that give without condition, when you meet people that walk with a kind of humility and grace like John did, then it's easy to believe in a loving God, because God comes alive through the people he created. God didn't just make us and then stay up in heaven. God made us so that we could somehow exude his Spirit, and that's exactly what John did. Somehow, in a dry waller like John, the Spirit came alive. He not only touched their ceilings and their walls, he touched their heart and their souls. And him, the Spirit, became real. You know, it's really that crazy, and it's that simple. That's the message. That's what we try to share on Sunday morning and Thursday night. One of you, a little over a week ago, you were visiting a former coworker in their home. You just went over there for a cup of coffee or a beer. And during the course of your conversation, somehow the person you were with that evening was sharing their story. And I guess they happen to have an adult son who's going through some tough times, and she and her husband are trying to help their son financially, and they have to keep on working because it's kind of drained a lot of their savings. And they were talking about how things are kind of tight, but they didn't ask for anything. And then you called me on the phone the next day, and you said, Don, I was at somebody's house, and they didn't ask for anything, but they're barely making ends meet. And they said, Don, is there anything that we can do? Well, we did something. And yesterday, when I got the mail, this letter was in the mail, and I'd like to share part of it with you. This lady writes, she said, Dear Pastor Don and the people of All Saints, you know, I shared some of my problems with one of your friends, and I didn't expect or want anything. It was just good for one evening to have a shoulder to lean on and to cry on. And then I opened an envelope when he came over the next day, and I saw this very generous gift. I am overwhelmed with emotion. It's not about the money or the amount. To think that strangers who don't even know me can be so kind. You have no idea how this has touched my heart. And more than this, you have renewed my faith in God. I've been praying to God for strength, wondering if God even listens to people like me who don't even go to church. I can't thank your church enough for your kindness. You, strangers, are an answer to my prayer. You know, I'm not unlike you, that I sometimes doubt, where is God's voice, and does God listen to us? You know, I worry about people like the Drywallers family having to say goodbye to their dad and their grandpa at a time like this. I worry about that lady that one of our friends went to visit the other night. I worry about the children's hospital that Sarah was raising money for this morning, and all those kids that had to be in the hospital and couldn't be in New Year's and Christmas with their families. I worry about that one or two kids at Stag who don't sing in the choir because they can't afford to wear the things where they come and they sing like to our church on a Sunday morning. I even think of someone like Dan Misek, who will be in the prayers because he had an attack and had to go to Good Samaritan Hospital, and that's where he is today instead of being at a party on New Year's Eve. And then I think to myself, I, like you try to listen to God's voice, and you often wonder where God's voice is. And then I realize that God's voice is right here, and it lives in each one of you. Amen. If you're able to, please rise for the creed. It's on page 105.